And of course, I only open with recording things on Wednesday. And there we go. And on Wednesday, October 29th, 2025 at 10:03 a.m. Eastern Time with Mr. Tom Burbage, who, you've been on here once before when we talked about your book, The Inside Story of the F-35, the Lightning II. And that link is in the description. It's on Audible. It's for my generation who can't read. It is on Audible. And yeah, we were just kind of talking beforehand about different machines with personalities, and I was telling you about how this camera only works when it's colder out, and the SR-71 and machines having personalities. But another thing that I was just thinking of last night for people that are, for lack of a better phrase, kind of U.S. Air Force heads who just geek out at all the aircrafts. We kind of are in like a little golden age right now with the F-47, the next generation, the NGAD, the B-21. The X-59, I believe, made its first flight yesterday. And then the X-BAT, which I saw last week, that vertical takeoff and landing UAV, but not manned. I mean, I guess what, UCAV or autonomous. Uh, it's kind of I'm kind of geeking out right now. It's all these things are coming together, which you know, sometimes you feel like you'll see, sometimes you feel like you'll never see in 100 years. But I'm going to shut up. Could you please introduce yourself? Because you have one of the more wild backgrounds of any guest I've had, and I don't think I'm going to do it justice.
Okay, Thomas. Well, thanks for having me. And my background is I was a Navy brat, raised in a Navy family. My father was a career naval aviator. Most of my role models were naval aviators. And when I left high school, I had two objectives. One was to play Division I football, and the other one was to be a naval aviator. And I got to do both at the Naval Academy. And I graduated there at the end of the 60s, 69 exactly, and had a tour flying E2s off of aircraft carriers. I was the first E2 guy to get selected to go to a Navy test pilot school. And I did that for the year of 1974. Went back aboard a carrier as catapult and investigator officer. I had 140, 150 young sailors that a number had a choice of going to jail or going in the Navy. So it was a leadership challenge. But we had a great team and set records on the catapult and arresting gear operations aboard the USS Eisenhower, which at the time was a brand new ship. It was its maiden cruise. Today it's a relic, and the new carriers are coming out. It's been a while, but I then left active duty, went into the reserves, flew A-7s for the Navy out in Point Mugu, California, and worked for Lockheed before they were Lockheed Martin. And over the course of that 30-year career, I ran the F-22 Raptor program, followed by the F-35 Lightning II program, which is why we're talking today, because after I retired, we wrote a book about the human experience of that non-technical, generally speaking, non-technical story about the journey of the F-35, which is probably one of the more remarkable programs in history in that it involved all three U.S. services, 9 initial allied countries. Today it's almost 20. And it's gone through its growth spurt and has become an adult, or is becoming an adult program, which is the hardest part, to get to the point where programs like that actually realize the potential that they started with, which is, joint service allied operations around the world and the ability to form global coalitions that no adversary can really compete with in terms of numbers and participants. So that's where we are today. I've been retired for about, I retired in 2013, so I'm retired about 12 years. Sit on a couple of interesting boards, one of which is AeroVironment, the drone manufacturer. You mentioned drones a minute ago. The next wave, in my view, is piloted and unpiloted aircraft flying together in a flight, which requires a very robust control link between the piloted and the unpiloted aircraft, which is probably the biggest technical challenge of that. But there's all kinds of interesting options you can think of where you could, if I'm flying in my F-35 and I have an unmanned UCAV on my wing, I can send that UCAV in. It's attritable, that's the current word, much more so than an F-35, and I can have the enemy light off his systems and I can prosecute those
What,
signals.
what did you say it was?
attritable. That means I can afford to lose,
Okay. All
generally
right.
speaking, I can afford to lose it more than I can afford to lose a high-end F-35. So,
Yeah.
there's lots of interesting things going on in that world. And if you think about it, the contract for F-35 was 2001. This is 2025. So we are 24 years later. There's over 1,200, I think there's 1,230 plus F-35s flying in the world somewhere. And the reality of being able to join up, whether you come from a land base or a small ship or a big ship or an allied country, once you join up, you're all the same in the fight. That's a really powerful operational change in the way things have been done historically. So that reality is now here, and I think we're seeing the world start to exploit that.
And I think it's almost a trope to, rail against any big program that the Pentagon has, and sometimes there are merits for it. But I think the F-35 really didn't get a fair shake just from the public at large, and or even people that are, I have a biology degree, but I've always just geeked out about this stuff and reading about this stuff. It's a pretty tall order, what you had just said, right? That all the services, and it has to have variations for everything from, land-based runways to aircraft carriers. It's got to be, we're going to sell it to other countries, which we don't do with the F-22. And then you're going to wrap it all up, and you're not even producing something that's 30 years old, where it's like, yeah, we can kind of, it also has to be cutting edge. So it has to be cutting edge, fulfill the needs of all the services, not be so, I guess, bleeding edge like the F-22, or I guess they have different roles. It has to be interchangeable and it has to work. All the while, we're not in a vacuum. This isn't a video game where you can redo. You're also in real world environments where threat vectors are changing. And then you got to do it all in a country where, I suppose this is where it would be nice to be the Soviet Union or China. You could just silence anyone that talked about it. You're in a republic where the funding is for the most part looked over. It's a pretty insane order to deliver. And then once you do deliver it, you really don't even, not that you'd need one, you don't even really get an apology, right? The
It's true.
truth goes through three phases, right? It's mocked, violently ridiculed, and then accepted as self-evident. And I think the last one's the most important. It's not just that it's accepted. It's accepted by the people that hated it are now going, well, it's very clear we always needed the F-35. And you're just kind of sitting there, and like you're been retired, and you're like, these people are horrible. Like you never get the hats off on it, and anything you could brag about is probably classified. So I mean, it really is kind of it is a humble endeavor. I at least get to brag about like podcast stats and analytics. You don't even get to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right. And what people really don't understand is the contract was awarded in 2001 with much of, not much, but a good portion of the technologies were not mature or production ready at the time. So then you go through the engineering phase and you design airplanes that are supposed to operate in three radically different environments. One can land vertically, one can withstand the stresses of catapults and arresting gear, and one, takes off and lands on runway, so it doesn't have to worry about all that structural weight. But when you get in the cockpit, if you were an F-35 guy and I had all three of the airplanes lined up there, when you're in the cockpit, if you're blindfolded when you got in, you wouldn't really know which one you're in. From the human to the airplane interface, that's common. Okay, what's not common is the airplane itself. And just as recently as this week, I was correcting somebody in the blogosphere who was saying that we've never had a successful airplane where one airplane could serve all three services. And my response is, if you think the F-35A, B, and C are one airplane, you're dramatically mistaken. They're quite different in terms of their structural and the engineering that goes behind the airframe itself. Yes, the human machine interface is the same, software is the same, weapons are the same, sensors are the same, and that really reduces your infrastructure cost of training and maintenance and those kind of things. over the life of the airplane. So there's a lot of things that get forgotten, and we're in that phase three of acceptance that you mentioned now. And people say, well, we always knew it was going to be a success. Well, that's not true. We basically, it was a bit of a fight during the early years. And if you think about it, the European aerospace industry didn't want to see a U.S. dominated international market, with the Eurofighter having just come out around the same time. And the competitors, the Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, didn't want to see a single airplane necessarily led by one company when defense infrastructure, needs to be competitive in the long term. So that's what led to all the complicated teaming arrangements and things like that. Even the engine side, with Pratt Whitney building the engine for both the F-22 and the F-35, basically they have a lock on the fighter market until some kind of an engine upgrade is required, which is about to happen here. And then that opens up competition with General Electric and other engine manufacturers. So there's a lockdown phenomena that goes with the industrial base when a big decision like this is made that's unusual. In fact, I don't think it's ever been done before where like it has been on F-35. But the flip side of that is we had the Allies and their embassies in Washington were strongly supporting the program, and the U.S. infrastructure was now moving from components to subassemblies and assemblies. So there's about probably 20, 25 maybe states in the United States that have work on F-35, whereas there's 50 that have work on the B-2 or the F-22 because they're U.S. only. So
Could you repeat that stat?
yeah, there's about, and I don't have the exact number in my
Sure.
finger, but there's about 20 to 25 U.S. companies that provide major components for the F-35. And many of them have international sub-elements to them because industrial participation was a government-to-government commitment for any ally that joined the program. A U.S.-only airplane like an F-35 or I mean, sorry, like an F-22 or a B-2 or a B-21 at this point, primarily is a U.S. supply chain. And so there's a much larger number of states involved. There's much stronger political support because each of those states has a congressional types and senators. In our case, we had to substitute some of that with allied embassies in the U.S. that were participating in the program and had a stake in the program. So it's funny how the political support for a program changes, based on how the program is actually constructed.
Yeah, and even that, the common criticism you get is it's almost eye rolling at this point, but oh, that's the military industrial. It's like I I view it as this is an insanely complex puzzle,
Yeah.
and you have to work in the parameters that you have. And it's again, okay, you could look at something like a totalitarian dictatorship. Yeah, you could just clamp it all down, right?
Yeah.
Those countries also historically don't produce the type of innovation that comes in a free and open society. So you can't have one without the other. And yeah, when it's a full stop, all built here. I remember seeing something a while ago. I forget what it was. There's something one of the defense contractors was talking about. They had this entire department, and it was all about making sure programs had pieces from factories in all states so that you could call them political support, which again is just another piece of the puzzle. And then I think it was in Skunkworks by Ben Rich, and he's
Mhm.
talking about, his predecessor, Clarence Kelly Johnson, and they're coming in and they're talking about the F-117. And, Ben Rich is all psyched and it's got the radar cross section of a ball bearing. And, the Pentagon, they loved it so much that they slapped special access program on it. And Ben Rich is like, this is awesome. And I think the exact quote from Clarence Kelly Johnson is, Rich, you dumb shit, you have no idea what you just did. And it completely, they talked about how you couldn't go to the bathroom without two people signing out. And, it's the whole thing. But with an extreme program like that, I think John McCain said, what do we know about the B-21 Raider? And this was obviously years ago. We know that it flies, meaning it was so locked down that he couldn't get, his eyes on it. That's also makes it the flip side. I think what you're saying is relatively, I mean, none of this stuff is easy. It's relatively easier when it's just this is American made, this is, this is the bleeding edge. You get that full congressional support and you also have all those supply chains locked down. The F-35 is, I guess an easier way to say this is, man, when you're in college, it is so much easier when you and one friend decide what bar you want to go to versus being at a party 10 miles out and you all have to share the same like Uber. You all have to agree. And you all have the same intention. It's not even like you're wildly different. You all want to go to the bar and drink and see women. You can't corral that. How can you corral this? And I think that's kind of another thing about is that really is a wild application. And like you said, none of this isn't an old plane that we're, like Iran still flying the F-4 Phantom. This isn't an old thing. You're also doing something that is a next generation fighter. And it's, again, not to kiss your ass, but like I was saying, you're not even gonna get like the thank you or that was cool. You just they'll maybe stop attacking you.
Yeah. I'll tell you an interesting vignette about the F-117. When I went to work for Lockheed in 1980, um, I went to work in the Lockheed company in Burbank, California. I went out there to be a test pilot, but they weren't testing anything. So I got off into the business development management side. But I was a lunchtime runner, and I would join up with my buddies, and we would run around the campus there at the Burbank Airport, which is where Lockheed was located at the time. And there was this one building that we would run around, and the windows were painted over. I never knew what was going on in there. And we did know that there were some cameras that were up on a hill and outside the property in Burbank that were filming all the time. And we didn't know who owned those. And so it was all kind of mysterious. And then one morning I came in to work early, like 4:30 in the morning for some visitor that was coming. And the airport was normally closed between 10 at night and 7 in the morning, but it wasn't really closed. And there was a C-5 about to take off on the runway. And if you know Burbank Airport, it's a very short runway. But what was happening was the F-117 was being built in that building that I was running around. I had no idea it was actually there. And the airplane would be pulled out in the middle of the night and put in the back of a C-5 and flown out to Tonopah, which was the site
Yeah.
in the desert where the airplane operated out of. For years, it was not known. And I continued in my career. I was there for about 8 years, and I went to Washington, and I was called back to Burbank to be briefed on a classified program so I could talk to the House Intelligence Committee. And I went into the same building I'd been running around for years, and I went through an airlock, and I went through a second airlock, a two-person ID kind of thing. And here's the production line building F-117s in the middle of Burbank Airport, and nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew what they were doing. So in fact, the Skunk Works under Kelly Johnson, and then later on to Ben Rich, was an embedded
Hmm.
management structure. If you looked at the Lockheed org chart, you wouldn't see a Skunk Works head. He was a VP for something, VP of engineering or something like that, but he was actually the president of the Skunk Works. Then when Lockheed and Martin Marietta merged and they moved the headquarters to Maryland, um, and shut Burbank down, and they basically moved the Skunk Works out to Palmdale. It came out of the closet, so to speak, and it's known now that the Skunk Works exists in Palmdale. It's still not well known what they actually do, but the whole test ranges up there, you know, in that part of California, are still quite active on what they're working on. So, but that story I always used to tell folks that I never had no idea what was going on inside that building until I was called back to get briefed on it. And there was full airplanes being built in there and taken out in the middle of the night.
That and my first thought when you said you're running around, I'm like, man, you're lucky you weren't shot. Like that's something I feel like I would do if you run. I think in 2020, right when a couple months after I started the show, I'd like to think I'm wiser now. I would just I try to contact anyone I wanted. I remember I called Northrop Grumman. I literally called Northrop Grumman and started asking about the B-21. And I just remember there's a woman with a British accent just tore me a new one. And I was like, I just want to, yeah. And, since then I've talked to people in like the CIA and, defense intelligence. They're like, yeah, you're absolutely like probably labeled as a probe. And I was like, well, but that is, yeah, it's that in Skunkworks, they talk about how they seized the coffee mugs because somebody had made some coffee mugs for the
Yeah.
people on the inside and it had the silhouette of it. And they were like, you cannot have this. And it's that to, I guess, to compare something like the F-35. I got to imagine, and I'm not quite on firm ground with this. To a degree, I imagine that it's almost easier when a program is locked down like that. Is
Well, yeah, you don't have all the oversight. You don't go through all the program reviews, and most of the time, classified budgets are not accessible by the general budgeting process, and so they tend to keep their funding on F-35. It was interesting. I call it the Rubik's Cube. It's the Rubik's Cube of programs, which if you're not adept at the Rubik's Cube, it's very hard to make a Rubik's Cube line up on everything. But it's kind of like that. It's got so many different variables in it. But what was different about it was the U.S. government invited closest allies who were at the time, or are at the time, flying U.S. frontline airplanes, frontline fighters, to join the program and actually contribute funds to the development of the F-35. In return for that, the government-to-government agreements committed to best value participation as industrial partners. Well, now you got to rethink your whole process about, okay, how do I do my supply chain on this? Most international aerospace and defense suppliers are not equivalent to U.S. in terms of their tolerance control, the modernization of their tools. There's a huge modernization effort that had to go on amongst the principal partners so they could actually build parts that could go on an F-35, because the precision that's required for stealth is several orders of magnitude more than a C-130 or another airplane that they may be working on. So there's huge investments going on. Some of them by the governments themselves. In some countries, the government was willing to invest in. I'll take an example. Norway. They were willing to invest in Kongsberg, which is the primary defense company in Norway, and fund some of their factory development. And in 1 year, we opened up a world-class factory in Turkey, a world-class factory in Norway, world-class factory in Denmark, that were remade factories that could now produce either metal or composite parts for an F-35. You don't normally go through that. Normally, suppliers bid, low bid gets it, unless it's a very high-tech thing, and all that was kind of out the window. So what we had to do, it's interesting, I think, on F-35, was I was the general manager, executive, my title was Executive Vice President, General Manager, F-35. So I controlled it. I was the F-35 guy. And the first couple of years, you're doing mostly engineering design. You're basically designing the airplane. You're not building much. You may be building a couple of test airplanes, but you're not anywhere near a production rate. And then about the fourth or fifth year, we were finding those little pieces of technology that needed to have a breakthrough that we hadn't broken through on yet. And one of those, which we can talk about later if you'd like, was the tail hook for the Navy airplane. There were some dynamics associated with trying to hide a tail hook inside an airplane for stealth reasons that you don't have on an F-18 or any other airplane the Navy's ever had. So we were able to go through that breakthrough, but it adds engineering time, and therefore you start seeing the term cost overruns and stuff like that. And even the ability to take stealth to sea, when you think of two of the three F-35s are going to sea, either on L-class ships with the Marine Corps on the B version or Navy aircraft carriers, and there's no temperature and humidity controlled hangar space on a ship. So you had to make the LO element,
oh,
low observability elements, much more saltwater friendly, if you will, than you have to do on a B2 or an F-117 or an F-22 that you can take inside a hangar and you can control the environment. But those things had to happen along the way as we came on to them. There was inadequate technology maturity in a couple of areas. So while you're doing that, you're also trying to set up your global supply chain. and find out what companies could actually do work, and how do we get them to the point where they could be a valid and a capable supplier. Because the government said, the U.S. government agreement said that we would do that as the prime contractor. So about 2004 or 5 years into the program, we decided we really couldn't manage the program with one person in charge. Somebody has to be sitting in the conference room on the daily staff call, making sure that the engineers are working and doing the right things and that problems are identified. And somebody needs to be on the road, whether it's either in Washington or in one of the 9 partner countries. Because if you think about it, every one of those countries has its version of the Pentagon and has its version of the Congress. And the budgets that they're approving to go into the F-35 program have to go through the same kind of mini process where it's supported by the operator, it's funded by the government. So it was a huge, huge task. So we split it up. So I became kind of the outside guy. I lived in Washington during the budget cycle when the US budget was going on, and I'd be on an airplane going to Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Turkey, Canada, Australia. And another peer of mine who had a similar title, he was executive VP, general manager of the F-35 program. I was executive VP, general manager of F-35 program integration. We had one word difference in our title, but my job was outside, his job was inside. For the last 10 years, maybe the last 8 years I was on the program, that was my position, which is really what opened up the book, because I was actually living the human journey every day instead of the technical journey as we got into the later stages of the program.
I guess there's like two quick conclusions you could draw from that. Well, like first, I mean, I guess a third. The first is wildly impressive that all of these, and again, it's for people listening that maybe aren't entirely too read up. You're also not doing this with like a Humvee or like a Jeep during World War II, where
Yeah.
God bless, but it wasn't classified. It was just plugging and playing. You're also doing this with a next generation fighter. So I guess so the first conclusion is it's impressive. The next two would be it had never been done before, and we did it, and we showed it could be done, and now you have somewhat of like a homogenous to a degree Air Force of all the allied countries. The other conclusion would be this was awful. We're never doing this again. Like, is it are either of those, or is it somewhere in the middle? Is it, it's like you said, it's to reach that kind of adult program where the truth is self-evident. That's a pretty incredible achievement. Is that on the table again? Or I mean, I guess it's so far away, but theoretically, is it something where it goes, we did it, I can't believe we did it, we can do it again? Or, like the early ICBMs get better and better and better versus something like the Apollo program, it's like, we did it, that was amazing. Yeah, we're not doing that again.
I think it's somewhere in between. I think the environment at the time, late 90s, early 2000s, all 3 U.S. services had their own development program going on. The Air Force was developing multi-role fighter, MRF. Navy was developing, at first they were told to develop a naval variant of the F-22, but since the Air Force had the lead on that, Navy doesn't like to take Air Force airplanes and make them carrier capable. The Navy had their own program, which was the A-12, I think it was. And then the Marine Corps was heavily involved in trying to get a replacement for the Harrier and was under contract. In fact, that's the whole X-22, X-35 story. They had the original Harrier prototype was called the X-32, and that requirement was then rolled into F-35. So there was already a prototype, and that's why the numbers are three digits apart. But yeah, so that was happening at the same time. There was a sense that the Cold War was over. The wall came down. We don't need to be buying single mission airplanes like F-22s. They truncated that program at about 182 airplanes, and I was the VP general manager of that program first, which was very interesting because when you finally get an airplane to come down the cost curve and you're at the flat part of the curve where the airplane is now affordable, that's when it was canceled right as it reached that point. So the F-22 was canceled, and there was a thought that we don't fly and fight alone. We fight as joint with U.S. services, and we fight as joint allied with our closest allies whenever we're doing peacekeeping or long-term combat operations. So why not have an airplane that all of them can operate, that are interoperable, and will share this next journey on the F-35? So the environment was right to do that. If you look at what's happening right now, you have the F-47,
Hmm.
first politically numbered aircraft that I know of,
Yeah.
because there is an actual decree in Department of Defense, Department of War now, of how airplanes are numbered.
Oh, really?
There is, yeah. That's why the X-32 and the X-35 were three apart. There was two other programs in between there that you didn't hear much about.
Yeah. That's
And
such a bad precedent. Don't. Ah.
yeah, yeah. So now you have the F-47, which is a Boeing contract,
Mhm.
and you have the FAXX, and X-47, I guess, is the lead on NGAD, this connected to
And
NGAD.
yeah.
And you have the FAXX, which is looks like it's going to get restarted. It sort of got shut down in the last budget cycle, but now the Senate has appropriated, I think, $1.4 billion, something like that, to restart that effort. So now if you look at it, the Marines have the F-35B, Air Force is off developing next generation air dominance fighter. Navy's separately developing FAXX. They're sort of back to where they were in the late 90s. Every service wants its own airplane. They don't want to be second in line for something that's modified for their use. I would argue that the F-35 was never that way. Those airplanes were designed from the very beginning for the environment they had to operate in. It was just the human machine interface that I mentioned earlier that was common.
Mm.
Common sensors, common weapons bay, but structurally the airplanes are quite different. So it's interesting that we've sort of come full circle. So now will somebody in a few years say, we don't have enough money to do all these development programs. Let's do one airplane again. And they do the forensics and see whether it's actually cheaper or not. One of the things that drove a lot of cost on the F-35 was, if you think about it, historically, the Air Force and the Navy have radically different test organizations. The testing tends to be done out of Edwards Air Force Base for the Air Force. It tends to be done out of Pax River for the Navy. The Navy has congressional language, legal language that makes them the purveyor of any airplane that gets put into naval service because of the expertise of having to go to sea. Um, the F-4 was probably the last example of an airplane that was modified. It was built for the Navy, but then structurally lightened for the Air Force version. Um, Maybe you could say the F-111, but it never got into use by the Navy. So there's not a good track record of airplanes being developed for one service and then being adapted to another service, as opposed to the F-35 process, which basically designed all three airplanes separately for the operational environment and then made them as common as you could make them from a pilot's perspective.
And then existing in the same timeline as the B-52
Yeah.
is just,
Or
or just,
C-130.
yeah, right? Or just keep trucking. And I guess for something like that, there might be, he kind of nailed it once. Like they're still using the U-2 in South Korea. I guess some things I don't know, maybe you hit the ceiling relatively early. It's like it's a bomber.
Yeah.
It's not, yeah, sure you have the B-2, but I mean, in terms of just like, a bomb truck, you have the B-52. And obviously this isn't a novel idea, but it really does seem like we're coming up on I don't know, the leading edge, the shock wave of unmanned. And I mean, for most of my life, I was born in 90, but you have the Predator, the Global Hawk, the Reaper, all that stuff. But with both the advance of AI and what we can commercially see is impressive. So God knows what's being done privately or under classification, as well as, and it's kind of interesting that they're both kind of happening at the same time. Maybe they were always going to. I would imagine you're also hitting the upper ceiling of the maneuvers a craft can make without just pulverizing the pilot.
Yeah.
How many? It's wildly impressive if you can make a plane do that. but there is a limit, I would imagine, to the amount of G's a pilot can take, and do you want to risk a pilot blacking out in a $100 billion aircraft?
But
Are we seeing the final? And it'll never be completely over, but the final wave of piloted in the conventional sense.
there's a couple of theories about that, Thomas. One is that if you fast forward to a world where there's nothing but unmanned aircraft, combat aircraft, then do you really are you if you don't hold human life at risk, are you really in combat, or are you just playing a game? Are you littering the ground with metal from unmanned airplanes that have shot each other down? But I think there was an interesting Star Wars episode years and years and years ago, way before, unless you're a Star Wars fan, you wouldn't have recalled this, but where two countries were at war with each other and they were all using all unmanned aircraft, and they would keep a score, and whoever won, they would march the losing side into a gas chamber and kill that many people because human life had to be tied to the combat result. So as you get into an extreme unmanned aircraft world, then you got to question whether you really have whether it's really combat anymore or not. On the other hand, I think there's lots of missions that people would rather have an unmanned aircraft do. There used to be an acronym for it. I can't remember. It was like 3Ds, and one of them was dirty. Dirty missions. In other words, flying into a heavily radiated area or those kind of things. So there's certainly an application for them. And the more capability you put into an unmanned aircraft, where you look at a Global Hawk, or you look at a Reaper, those are almost the same size as manned aircraft. So it's not a cost issue. It's really, do you want all the peripheral equipment that goes along with keeping a human alive in an airplane? You can take that out and put more weapons on it. Those kind of trade-offs are going on. So I think you'll see a combination of piloted and unpiloted aircraft going in the future. Having worked on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, it's hard for me to imagine a flight deck full of unmanned airplanes. But there's obviously got to be a controller, so every unmanned airplane has to have a body with a box that's moving the airplane around on the flight deck. Well, how do you do all that? There's still, and if you can jam the control signal, which is kind of why the world that I sort of see out there is a manned and an unmanned aircraft flying together with a low probability of intercept data link, sort of like the F-35 has today. I can fly F-35s up to 40 miles apart and still communicate with each other without emitting any of my sensors. I could do the same thing in controlling an unmanned airplane. But if you can jam the control signal, you have turned the unmanned airplane into an unguided airplane. So that's always been the limitation. If sending a wave of unmanned airplanes in to attack a heavily defended air defense system, all you do is jam the control systems and shoot them down. Now that lasers are becoming the weapon of choice. What doesn't make sense is to fly, and recently in the Red Sea and other places where you have an aircraft carrier flying against drones, and you shoot a $2 million missile at a $500,000 drone, that the economics don't work out in the long term very well when that's the exchange ratio. So you're seeing a whole lot of emphasis now on lasers that you can point very accurately, and you can basically destroy incoming drone type stuff. So as I mentioned in the early days, I do have the privilege of sitting on the board of AeroVironment, which is one of the leading companies in the drone world, and watching how the technologies are evolving, particularly in the area of AI, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are really dominating that space. And part of it's because you don't have to worry about keeping the human alive inside the airplane. You can do more things with it, in terms of technology. So there's lots of interesting stuff happening in those worlds, but how they merge is going to be interesting to watch. And will there ever be a world of nothing but unmanned aircraft? I kind of doubt it myself.
Yeah, that seems to be the conclusion is we're just going to see an incredible advance in jamming and EMP technology over the next decade or two. It's going to ramp up to, yeah,
Yeah.
things we can't imagine. And of course, yeah, lasers instead of firing an actual, kinetic vehicle at something, just beam it. Yeah, if you're going in an F-35 and you've got, or if you have, yeah, some unmanned, if you have some UAVs being piloted, that could be jammed. And then I I guess there's always the risk of not giving it full autonomy to where it doesn't need an uplink because that, just Terminator scenario. When you're saying that, all I was thinking is like, or I don't know, somewhere in between. You make the drones, they're not piloted, but they're not autonomous. You give it a preset flight program and say,
Yeah.
hit this target. And then I don't know, you Faraday cage the plane so nothing comes in or out, and it just goes and does the mission regardless of what's being jammed. And I was thinking like, and if you had to like change the thing, I don't know, maybe you have the equivalent of like refueling, but it's just an uplink, but it just gives it a new mission order. I mean, I guess if you just made it like a copper shell, it could do that. But then at that point, it's like, well, that's just a Tomahawk. That's just a cruise missile.
Yeah.
Why not just do that?
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of work is going on in GPS denied environments, because you're not going to necessarily have those satellites if you ever get into a real war. But the space, this is just me talking now. I don't have any inside information on this, but the fidelity of space photography now,
Yeah.
you can basically do mapping. You can have a vehicle that can put its overlay of what it's flying over onto a very high fidelity map and basically navigate that way without any satellite input. Whether you could do that on a large scale or not, it kind of remains to be seen. But there are things you can do now to reduce the dependency on space assets, because that's probably where the next war domain is. There's a new movie out on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it or not, called House of Dynamite. Have you seen it?
No,
It
no.
just came out this week, but it's pretty good. It's a story about an unidentified nuclear ICBM that's launched from somewhere in the water. They don't know where it came from or what country it came from, but it's inbound to the U.S. And it's all about the backstories of how the people operate when the countdown is going on. There's 8 minutes till impact. There's 7 minutes till impact. Looks like it's going to hit Chicago. Yada yada yada. So it's interesting to look at the human dilemma. It ends without any conclusion because I don't
Oh
think they.
God.
So,
Yeah,
but
I mean, it makes me think of all those like war games that we now know about decades later in the Cold War, where it's like somebody had put the wrong cassette in, and next thing you know, Cheyenne Mountain's like there's 2,200 nuclear missiles inbound, and
yeah,
that was with a cassette. I mean, it would be pretty, I don't know, it'd be pretty stupid to assume that we couldn't have an equivalent with these things that are, I mean, literally billions of times more complex. 70 years later, it
yeah.
it could cascade so much worse than that. Yeah, I remember watching this video, this Air Force guy talking about someone in the 60s. It was called Atran. I would imagine it's ATRAN. I don't know. But it was for, I think it was for B-52s. And they would get topographical maps. Maybe it was for Operation Chrome Dome for the potential routes you would take. And then they would remake it almost like a little, model, like a little, like a train model town type thing. And then they would they would roll a camera over these tables that were like 10 feet wide and like 100 feet long and essentially do mapping. And again, it's impressive for the 60s of what it would look like. And then upload that to, I guess, the training programs or maybe even on the plane itself. And it was like if everything goes down and if the radars are fried from static or bombs, you just have this crude, flying over this little Lego town, and it's like that's where you're supposed to go. So I would imagine that's probably advanced in 60 or 70 years too.
Oh yeah, yeah. The simulations these days are incredible. The simulators themselves are incredible. But we were doing a embedded training or a simulation spot on the F-22 years and years ago. This is over 20 years ago, and the opening of the video was an actual footage from Japan when they were planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. And there's a Japanese guy sitting in a zero, and there's 10 other people on the ground with a huge map of the Pacific and the Hawaiian Islands there, and they're pulling the map underneath the guy as he's sitting in the cockpit of the airplane,
Oh,
practice the run, you know. So that was
it's pretty genius.
the first simulator, yeah. But now I had the experience in Denmark. No, it was in the Netherlands, where the Dutch research agency wanted to interest the F-35 program office in what they call their embedded training, where you could put a software load in the airplane. You could go out and all your systems would indicate that somebody hostile is trying to shoot you down, and you could actually get into a turning fight using images that were on your radar or EW system, as opposed to there being somebody real out there. So I jumped in the back of a Dutch F-16, and they took me out over the water. It was a bad day. It was total IFR. It was, low clouds and stuff. And all of a sudden, this target pops up on the screen, and it's a bad guy coming after you. And you do all your training on okay, how do I engage him? Is it a fly? Is it fight or fly or fight decision? Does he see me or doesn't he see me? On the F-35, normally he doesn't see you. So you can, if he's not directly coming at you as a threat, you can just watch them go by. But if they do engage you, then what's the turning fight and how do you deal with it? So all that was embedded just in a software display using the airplane's own sensors. We were not, there was nobody else in the sky but us. Nobody else would be stupid enough to fly on a day like that. But that was the start of looking at embedded training for pilots, as opposed to every pilot's got to go to a simulator and you got to schedule simulators,
Yeah.
around pilot schedules. Well, I can just go up in the air now and I can, use embedded training. So it's not as good as the flight simulators are today. They're really, really good. Very accurate, very realistic. Used to be they had motion sensors on them, where the platform itself would move and the pilot would get a sense of turning. They've sort of determined that's not really required this day and age, because an airplane like an F-35, as I say, gets to watch. You're watching the movie in the cockpit of the airplane. Basically, you're not looking at a radar or an EW system. You're looking at a big screen TV, and the world is going on around you. You don't know what sensor is giving you data. It's all fused, sensor fusion. And so you're just kind of watching the movie. And if you see a threat coming towards you, you either take action or you don't, depending on how you assess the validity of that threat. So you're not really in a turning and burning banking
Yeah.
like we used to do. It used to be within probably a mile or less of your wingman, always in sight, and you're protecting his six, and he's protecting your six, because the sensors weren't good enough to tell you who's at your six. Now airplanes fly in 30, 40 mile spreads. If one of them happens to get detected, then it's up to the bad guy to decide, okay, is the other one 30 miles that way or 30 miles that way?
Yeah. Or are they there at all?
Are they there at all? Yeah. And that's the other thing, is the whole cyber, science that now can inject threats.
Oh, though that's what I was thinking of is like, how good are these simulations? I mean, at what point do you turn that into an offensive weapon? At what point do you have an F-35? You have something physical flying, but if you're looking at the radar, I mean, is that one F-35? Am I seeing 320 F-16s? Is that a B-52? Is that even there? Is it not there? Is it, well, I'm tracking five F-35s, but aren't they stealth? Why am I seeing this? Shouldn't I not be able to see this? Yeah, man, that's it. That starts to get hairy. That starts to, how do you even, in a weird way, it almost seems like we're just gonna have like a global balkanization. Is we're just kind of assume that it's so advanced. It might be like a form of mutually assured destruction of you do, and then and at the same time, you really could have, and that's, when people say aircraft carriers are outdated, I think we're just going to see them outfitted with 100,000 little drones like that.
Yeah,
Why
it could.
would they do that?
It's hard to tell how they're going to go. The new, there's always been the argument of whether the carrier is vulnerable or not. But if you ever get into a real war, you'll operate a carrier a little bit differently in terms of approaching threat
Yeah,
scenarios. But you do have this huge air wing aboard.
yeah.
Is it
If anything, you just,
100 acres of sovereign property anywhere in the world?
yeah. And if you're, yeah, if anything, I would imagine. at the very least, it's almost a form of extended, you know, border security. If it's really a hot war and you don't want to risk these things, you could at least just push the east to west coast at 100 miles and be like, you get a little more of an early warning. And
So
yeah,
this is one of the things that I think is really interesting about the promise of an F-35, which is just now becoming reality, I think. And I'll give you a couple examples in a second, but the promise of it is in the emerging hotspots of the world. Let's say that I would say the two that are most talked about are the Arctic and the Pacific. Okay, you could argue the Middle East, but that's probably the third. On the Arctic, when Russia went into Ukraine, every country surrounding the Arctic is now an F-35 owner or in line to get F-35s, with the exception of Russia. So you start with Canada, you can work your way all the way around,
uh,
UK, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Belgium, all of them are now F-35. So you can marshal a significant air force, quote unquote, in the Arctic. If you look at the Pacific, these are not allies that fly and fight with us. That tends to be a European phenomena. In the Pacific, you have security cooperative participants, people that are security partners of ours, starting with Japan. It goes Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Australia. And you have, 10 US carriers, all of which could be outfitted, and probably more than 10 if you put the L-class ships in there with the F-35B. You have a very large cooperative force of F-35s in the Pacific now, growing every day. And then if you look in the Middle East, the carriers are deploying. The interesting deployment that I was reading about was the HMS Queen Elizabeth. My BAE Systems deputy that lived in Fort Worth with me when we were starting up the program later became the Queen Elizabeth project manager for BAE. His name is Mick Ord. He's now the CEO of a company in the UK. But that ship deployed to the Red Sea, and it didn't have enough. The UK hadn't bought enough F-35Bs yet, so they had two squadrons of U.S. Marine Corps F-35Bs and one squadron of UK F-35Bs, total three squadrons on the ship. And they went to a combat deployment off of Syria. As they were coming back to the UK, coming through the Mediterranean, the Italians flew their F-35Bs out and landed on the Queen Elizabeth. So on one day, you had Italians, Brits, and U.S. Marines all flying together off of the same ship in a one
whoa,
U.S. ship.
that's kind of wild.
It is kind of wild if you think about it. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's
fully interoperable. And jumping onto another ship and being fully integrated into their operations there's a learning curve associated with that.
yeah,
All of them being in the same airplane, there was no real learning curve. So
yeah. It's not 1945. Like that's insanely impressive for modern day, right? I would imagine the way it because there's what we think should happen, and then there's also with defense and weapons, for lack of a better phrase, it is sort of an inevitable, race to the bottom. It's like I think we could all agree. It's like, yeah, thermonuclear warheads on missiles aren't good, but they're doing it, so we have to do it. And that's kind of right in the real world, you do have to do that.
yeah,
It's ideally we wouldn't have, a gigaton of weapons pointed at each other, but it is what it is, and it's not kind of worked. It's actually worked very well for mutual assured destruction. Seeing last week the X-BAT, which looks like just the kind of you know the UCAV we've all kind of imagined, like a really little B-21, and the fact that the three things that were wild about it to me was like vertical takeoff, not help. I mean, literally, it's just on a pole and it goes straight up. Like, okay, that's wild. It lands on that pole too, and, and then it's not piloted. And I don't mean like it's not even piloted from somebody with like a remote control. It's actually autonomous. Those three things right there, that is such, and I geek out on that stuff. That is such a wild advancement. And the guy that was watching said it. He was like, now if you're a foreign adversary, you have to worry about every 20 by 20 foot patch of land on Earth. You don't have to go, you don't have to, it's easy to spot a runway, right? It's, you can find it. That's insane. It takes off, it's like those like Russian ICBM launch. You can just drive that thing around, take off vertically, and then land vertically, and it's not controlled by a human at all. Now, objectively, this seems horrible, but like nuclear weapons, maybe it'll work out. That to me was startling. And I know nothing about it. I think for the most part, it's probably classified, but it's called the X-BAT, BAT. And I don't even, I mean, I'm sure you know about it. I don't even know how you, is that what we're going to see? So you're saying, if all these things are unmanned on an aircraft carrier flight deck, you'd have to have somebody controlling all of them, right? Like the big Connex boxes, and that would be difficult. Okay, if they're not on the carrier and they're on, back home, and I have to worry about the data link. Or what if you just had an aircraft carrier just legitimately with just boxes of these things that you just shoot off vertically like a missile salvo, but they're autonomous aircraft with like a 3,000 mile. That is That's creepy. I don't even know how to go about this, but it seems like that's sort of if we don't do it, they will. I don't know. It seems like we're going over a very slippery, which I guess is what people have always said about weapons technology, but it seems like we're going over some sort of event horizon.
I think so. I think we're in the middle of a big transition.
Yeah.
There's something. I don't think that it's very clear what that is yet, but there's a transition definitely going on. Carriers, if you look at carriers and, the amount of real estate that's taken up by catapults and arresting gear and all the things that are unique to Navy airplanes that launch at heavy weights and recover at lighter weights, but still heavyweight. Um, you you could take all that out and open up a whole lot of space. Um, but the ships, the carriers are pretty mission uh, adapted to the mission of an
Yeah.
aircraft carrier.
Already, yeah.
It might be better to put the boxes you're talking about on a cruiser or some other ship that's got missile batteries already, boxes with
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't
that's a
know,
good point.
because it's expensive to operate, and of course the newer ones are all nuclear, starting with the Nimitz, I guess, are nuclear powered. So yeah, I don't know how it's going to all evolve. Whether the mission of the aircraft carrier and the mission of the Navy. There's a huge thing going on right now on the deficit in shipbuilding.
Yeah.
Doesn't have nothing to do with airplanes, but it's a hot topic now. With the quote unquote golden fleet and all these kind of concepts. That's another one that's we thought the F-35 supply chain architecture was difficult to set up around the world, but shipbuilding is even harder. And you don't build them very fast, or how long it take to build a Ford? I think it was like 7 years.
Yeah.
Area that just came that's now out there floating around. But so yeah, so shipbuilding is a whole other thing, and they're looking at the deficit between the number of Chinese ships and the number of U.S. ships. It's like 350 versus 280, something like that. So if you're just a numbers person, which I don't think anybody ought to be just a numbers person anymore, because the power of the punch is almost more important than the boxer that's punching. You know,
I mean, a terrifying thought would be, yeah, because aircraft carrier, I mean, although they're huge pieces of real estate, yeah, they're mission centric, the way they're set up, the hangars, the elevators, whatever. If you could just fit these things in shipping containers,
yeah.
y- there's a cost cut. Just go grab any evergreen ship, you know, put put some military, uplink on it in the bridge, surround that with a couple destroyers. Man, and how many shipping container ships are out? A trillion? You just, take a Connex box. That is like now you have one of those things launching legitimately, some of the huge ones. It was like 30,000 container. Now, granted, they're stacked, but man, and then you get really hairy. Yeah, why even make it obviously a military ship? Why not just have them going around and maybe make them, they actually are cargo ships,
There's a lot
but
of
you never know which one. It might launch an all out, you know, yeah. I mean,
That is a concept that's been talked about. How do you ra rapidly expand your fleet if it doesn't require catapults and arresting gear? You use
these
commercial.
all the shipping containers or the shipping container ships.
Yeah.
Well, as I knew it would, this podcast has already elevated my heart rate and got me going down. I do this like every week. I'll have on like one guest and and I know the topic is gonna like send me off the deep end and give me a heart attack. But I figured I kind of knew that was coming. But hey, gotta go for it. I mean, I'm in Portland, Maine. I'm just thinking like, yeah, you could slap that onto any little tugboat. I think isn't that what Kissinger wanted? Like
There's
nuclear
been a
weapons
couple
on
of studies.
barges.
There has been a couple of studies done over the course of time on could you do that? The reason why you couldn't, I guess it may violate some standards of separating military from commercial, but
I mean,
yeah.
yeah, but in all's fair in love and war. I guess what it really comes down to, and we'll wrap it up with this, is all of this stuff is possible. The reasoning why it's not happening is mutual assured destruction. You know, if oh man, what if China has 1,000 of those shipping containers? Well, we probably have 1,000 in China, and if you don't, we'll nuke you. Or it's the idea of China could easily destroy our aircraft carriers. Yeah, that's an act of war, though. That's not a little, not to make light of them. That's not, Iranian speedboats shooting 5.56 at an aircraft carrier. Take out an aircraft carrier. I mean, you're going to get a thermonuclear response. So I guess with all what I guess the piece I try to find is nothing is crazier than multiple independent reentry vehicles of multiple megatons on warheads that you launch from your own backyard, hit the other target in 30 minutes, and they come in at Mach 23.
Yeah.
And the reason, well, then how come they haven't been used? Mutual assured destruction. I try to find some solace in that, and that then applies to everything. Why is it not happening? Well, because they'll do it to us. And I don't know if there's a lot of peace in there. But I think if it applies to ICBMs, which are still the most terrifying weapon ever made, then it
Yeah.
has to apply to, shipping container jets or something.
So here's an interesting human dilemma. I mentioned the new movie on Netflix, but this missile starts out as a ballistic missile, and
Yeah.
then from an undisclosed origin. So they don't know whether it's China or Russia or North Korea, but it just suddenly appears. Somehow it got through the initial stage radars, probably through some sort of cyber. But then it goes from ballistic to being an ICBM, which puts the impact point anywhere in the US. But they don't know where it's coming from. So now they're in the countdown, 7 minutes, 6 minutes. They launch the B2s, but they don't know where to send them because it's undisclosed
Yeah.
origin. So they're trying to get all the North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese on the phone and say, did you shoot this? Did you shoot this? Well, the human reaction is nobody knows. So where do you send your B2s? They're loitering on the station somewhere until somebody figures out who actually sent the missile. And the movie ends before you figure all that out. But it is an interesting human dilemma that an undisclosed origin is much more difficult to deal with than it's coming from Russia or it's coming from Korea or it's coming from China, because you know who deserves the mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
You don't know where it's coming from. Either everybody's on alert, thinking they're going to go after everybody, or nobody's on alert. You know,
Whew.
it's one of those things. I think the woman that directed the movie was the same one that did the Hurt Locker. Did you ever see that
Yeah.
movie?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That was one of my favorites. Yeah, with Jeremy Renner.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that movie gave me a heart attack. So that makes sense that she would, yeah. I was gonna say,
Yeah,
yeah, in 2 days ago was Cuban Missile Crisis 62? So 2 days ago was the 63rd anniversary of it's a
yeah.
shame I can't remember his name, but the guy that saved the world, the guy, the political officer on that sub who decided against launching a nuclear torpedo because they thought war had already broken out. I don't know. I'm trying to find some hope in that. Like there are good people. I don't know. You're not helping. You're not helping the undisclosed missile launch.
Tell you one little last story
Yeah,
before I
sure.
cut off. This is the book that we were sort of talking about, and
Yeah.
I pulled this book off of my rack and I opened it up the other day, and I don't know if you probably won't, I'll just tell you what it is. But there's an inscription in it that I wrote here, which is to Charlie Kirk.
Oh, wow.
Charlie, and I never got to send the book. Charlie Kirk was appointed to the Board of Visitors for the U.S. Air Force Academy,
Wow.
President Trump, and we were sending a couple of the principals to to the people that had been there, and so um, I'm not going. I'm going to keep this one on my bookshelf forever because
Yeah.
it's written when I had intended to send it, and I never sent it because he was assassinated before that could happen. So it's just another little
No,
vignette.
no, that's a yeah, that's a kind of a beautiful note to end on is I mean, I'm 35. You know, I always complain about everything because I'm a human. But then you look at something like that, just in general. I mean, regardless of even what we're talking about,
Yeah,
like the fact that I always try to be grateful for the podcast that I get to be my own boss and it's cool and I get to talk to guys like you. But even on like a more abstract, like we're here. You
yeah,
know, yesterday I saw my mom and dad and took like a 3 hour car ride with my little brother and we just shot the shit and talking about, everything from, funny memories to what we're doing now. And that's a that's a sharp one that kind of brings it all back into focus. And this is not even about, F-35. That's just yeah, man. It's such a cliche, every day could be your last, be grateful, but there really is something like that to where I mean, what a blessing it is to have, 5 minutes ago I was like, this is anxiety inducing. What a blessing it is to be alive and be able to have a conversation
yeah,
that's
exactly.
anxiety inducing or not, to feel emotion, to be at all. And that's yeah, that you kind of blindsided me and not in a bad way.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I appreciate you having me on, and it's always fun to talk about these things. And
Yes, sir.
time marches on, as they say, but what I enjoy the most is talking to some of the young kids that are flying the airplane and knowing what it means to them and to their families that they can come home in that airplane, generally speaking, no matter what the direction is that they're given. So,
Well, it's also, if we're kind of going on this heartfelt ending is I don't know if I told you last time in 2014 I lost my older brother to suicide
oh
and
no,
he was 27 at the time. I was 23. I was at the University of Georgia. He was doing post grad work at Georgia Tech, uh, uh, GTRI, Georgia Tech Research Institute,
yeah,
and was
oh no,
doing stuff I believe it might have been Lockheed Martin on. I mean, I don't know what subdivision of subdivision, but he was the one that was always obsessed with and he was actually whereas I have a biology degree. He was actually from I mean my earliest memories is and my grandfather kind of instilled that in him and my grandfather wasn't a pilot but he loved it too and through my brother John is that's where I got a lot of this kind of obsession with because early on he'd be the one that would sort of show me like why this is so crazy and he's the one that got me into like popular mechanics and pop sci when I was in middle school and high school so like right when we're like invading Iraq, that kind of time, and learning about like the B-37 bomber and then all this stuff way down the road and yes, I mean in a way, kind of doing these like get to talk to somebody like you. I've had on not an F-117 pilot, but like an F-117 historian. I've had on an Apollo astronaut, Charlie Duke. In a way, for me is, and I've always loved this stuff, and I loved it before I lost my brother. Um, but there is kind of another level of it's in a weird way. I do feel sort of, some sort of touch to my brother and how much he would love I mean, if he's here right now, he'd probably be like, dude, just don't get this guy to say anything that's gonna land you both in Gitmo. Like, yeah, like, but like, so kind of on that more human note is, obviously I'm not a pilot. I do a podcast, but it's cool talking to guys like you because there is. whatever ethereal connection.
Yeah,
I do feel that whenever I get to do these shows. And so,
it's
yeah,
great.
it sucks, but it's, when Charlie Kirk was shot, I mean, my first thought was, or actually my little brother said it to me, and I hadn't thought about it until he said it. He was like, "Yeah, man, that's." I hadn't even thought. I thought that about the fact that he was a dad and a friend and whatever, but he was like, "Yeah, somebody just lost their baby," and I didn't think about it because he's 31. But as soon as you said that, it made me start thinking about my brother. Like, oh shit, like that's somebody's little babe that yesterday was crawling and today got shot. So, maybe that you and that book and me and my brother, it's, you know, I don't know, there's a human touch in there somewhere that
There
I
is
think
a,
is beautiful.
that's why this much less dramatic, but this book is the human story, not the technical story.
Yeah.
It is a human story. It's how do you get all these humans to come
Yeah.
together on a journey like this and come out with a product at the end. So
That was actually, I really appreciate that you brought that up. That kind of evoked these feelings, and it kind of helps
yeah,
does see the humans. I just imagine this like last little 5 minutes. This is like the clip I showed to Congress, and I'm like, this is why we can't have unmanned air. Really tug at the heartstrings. We need more. We need more fighter pilots. That's what I. That's what I would. That's all. And my brother would want that. He'd be like, yeah, use this. So, um, but yeah, Mr. Burbage, thank you for going on here, and for everybody listening, you can go in the description. The link straight to the Audible book is there. Highly recommend it. You don't need to be an aviation head to appreciate it, and yeah, this will probably be up tomorrow. I will send it to you.
that'd be
And
great.
dude, I appreciate your time, and it's awesome talking to you, and I look forward to the next one.
Super. Well, it's always good talking to you, Thomas. I appreciate you. Appreciate you. Appreciate what
Yeah.
you do.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your time, man. Mr. Burbage, everybody, guys, go in the description, go grab the book, give the good man a couple bucks. Thank you so much, Mr.